In this video, I'll demo the process of creating this morphing animation in After Effects. You can download my illustrations to follow along, or there's a 5-video series on how I created these plant graphics in Adobe Illustrator. All the links are in the description. I use a plugin called Overlord to transfer artwork from Illustrator to After Effects because it makes the process easier, faster, and more flexible. But I'll show you how to do this with and without Overlord. First, you'll need to have all of your Illustrator layers separated out like I cover in this video. If you're not using Overlord, you'll need to have every layer separated out like this. Then in After Effects, import the file and make sure to choose Composition Retain Layer Sizes. And open up that comp. Then you'll need to select all the layers, right-click, choose Create Shapes from Vector Layers. This might take a second because there's a lot of layers. You can delete all the vector layers, and a quick way to do this is to select where the color tag is, and then choose Select Label Group. It will select all of that color, and then you can hit delete. If you're using Overlord, just select the layers you want to move into After Effects. You could do this all at once, but I'm going to go plant by plant to stay organized. Click this push button to transfer layers. These are all shape layers, which is perfect because that's what we'll need for animating the morphs. Whichever method you use, I'd recommend color coding the layers for each plant. I'm going to use rainbow order. This makes it so you can easily keep track of what layers go with what plant. Since I'm using Overlord, I'm just going to transfer the first 2 plants for now, so my timeline will have less to deal with, and I'll transfer the rest of the plants as I need them. If you're not using Overlord, or if you're using my project file, you can hide and shy the layers you're not currently working on to declutter your timeline. Now we should be in the same place, or if you downloaded my animation ready file, this is your starting point. Let's start by animating the morph between the 2 planters. I'm going to hide and shy all of the layers that aren't associated with the pots, and then solo just the main shapes of the pots. I'm going to start the first morph at 1 second, and to stay organized, I'm going to set markers on the timeline to know when the morphs are happening. The keyboard shortcut to set a marker is Ctrl-8. So I'm going to set markers every 2 seconds. I'm going to animate the path property to morph these 2 pots. You can see that the path for the bowl-shaped pot has less points on it than the path for the pot for the daisy. So it's going to be easier to morph from the pot for the daisy to the bowl-shaped pot. So I can actually close up this bowl-shaped pot and then just animate this path property. I'm going to make each morph take about 20 frames, so I'm going to move my playhead to 1 second, 20 frames, and set a keyframe for the path to look like this. Then I'll go back to 1 second, and now I need to adjust these points to make them in the shape of the bowl-shaped pot. Right now all of the points and the whole path is selected, so first I need to unselect the path, and then click where it says Path 1. This will make it so that I can select the individual points on the path. First, I'm going to click and drag to select the top 2 points and then drag them down, holding shift to make sure that I'm not moving them side to side. And then I'm going to select these 2 points and bring them up. So these are going to meet the top 2 points. And then I need to bring these ones over here. So if you have points selected and you want to make sure that you're unselecting and reselecting the right ones, just click off of the path and then click back on, and then you can just click and drag. So now these 2 stacked points are selected, and I'll just drag them over, and then I'll do the same thing over here. And then these 2 points I'm going to drag down to overlap with these bottom points, and then I'll do the same thing with these ones. Now I'm going to need to zoom in and move these points out so that everything is overlapping. And I'm going to collapse these handles into the points so that they're not really there. And then I'll do the same thing over here. It's hard to see the shape that I'm going for because it's underneath, so I'm going to bring this pot up to the top so that I can see it, and then let's also color it something else. And to do this temporarily, I like to just go in and add the fill effect. I just double click and add the fill effect. It gives it this bright red, and then you can go in and just like adjust the opacity and lock this layer, and now you can easily see the shape that you need to see. I'm going to click and drag over all of these points and drag them over like this, and same with the other side. And then I need to adjust this handle to get the curve of the bowl. And I also need to adjust these points a little bit to make them land right where they're supposed to. And there's also a handle here that I can adjust to get the shape of this curve. Once you get that working, you can actually just delete this original bowl-shaped pot, because now we have a morph from the bowl-shaped pot to the daisy pot. Now let's incorporate some of the details. To see this line, we need to move it up. And when this is the bowl-shaped pot, the line is supposed to look like this. And then we could actually use this line to be the shadow on the daisy's pot. So to get from this to this, what we need to do is increase the stroke weight and move it down. So let's keyframe that. So I'll set a position keyframe, and I'll also go in and find the stroke weight and set a keyframe, and then move forward to 1 second, 20 frames. And let's bring this down and increase the stroke width. This line also needs to be matted so that it's only visible within the pot. So I'm going to toggle that closed and then click this toggle switches / modes button so that I can see the track mat options. And then I'm going to take the line and pick whip from the track mat to the pot. And then that turned off the visibility on the pot, but I still want to see the pot. So I'm going to turn the visibility back on and the solo. And now we're still seeing this shadow, but we don't actually need that anymore because we're recreating it with this pot line. So I'm going to delete that layer. So here's what we have so far. Now let's incorporate the vertical lines. So at 1 second, 20 frames, I'm going to animate the path property to look like this. And a quick way that you can bring up the path property for a bunch of layers is just by searching for it in the search bar. And then I'll just click the stopwatch to set all of these keyframes. And then back at 1 second, I'm just going to straighten these lines. I'm going to bring all of these middle points down to the bottom point. But first I'll show you a trick that you can use if you don't want to have to deal with the handles. You can go up to the pen tool, click and hold, and grab the convert vertex tool. With this tool, just click the points to remove the handles. And make sure you're setting a new keyframe. We don't want to get rid of the handles here. This is just going to get rid of the handles here. And then I'm going to go back to the regular selection tool and then just drag these points to collapse them onto the bottom point. And then I'll just select all of these and kind of straighten them out. So we have a vertical line. And I'll go through and do that for all of the lines. For the center line, we don't need to animate the path property since it's already a straight line. Animating these points starting at the bottom of the line and moving up into this shape fits the morph of the pot, which is why I chose to do it this way. Now that all those path keyframes are set, I'm going to select all the pot lines and make sure that they're matted to the pot. So they're only visible inside of the pot shape. I'm also going to animate the position and opacity of these vertical lines. So I'll make them spaced out further apart and then come together and fade in. Since these vertical lines won't start to be visible until here, I'm going to trim the layer, which is a good habit to get into in general to make sure that your timeline stays neat and organized. Next, let's work on morphing the tulip petals into the center of the daisy. I'm just adjusting the hidden versus visible layers to bring up the petals and center. Since the tulip petals have more points than the center of the daisy, I'm going to morph from the petals to the center. So I'm going to animate the path property of the petals, starting like this, and then I'll just drag the points to make it into the shape of the center. These points in the middle I'm going to bring directly up until they meet the edge of the yellow shape. If you can move points in only one direction, like perfectly vertically or perfectly horizontally, that often makes the morph look neater. As you practice making morphing animations, you'll figure out what looks good and what doesn't. And you can always experiment and undo things if it doesn't look good. Because this shape might not be totally perfect, I'm going to quickly switch between the shapes so no one will notice when watching the animation. So I'm just trimming the layers so that the petals end right when the center starts. I also need to animate the color, so I'll just keyframe that from red to yellow. So the color will change as it's morphing. There's one more thing that you can do to soften any harsh shapes like we have here. I'm going to go into the effects panel and add a simple choker to the petals, and then I'll just animate this starting at 0 and ending at 0, and then in the center I'll increase this choker to smooth out the shape. Now let's add in the daisy petals. Not everything has to morph from something else. Some things can just be animated in. First, I need to move the anchor points on all of these petals to the inside. Then I'm going to animate the scale and rotation properties so that they start kind of all vertical, and then as they're scaling up, they all expand out. I also need to adjust the layer order so that the petals are underneath the center. Next, I'm going to work on these petal lines, and first I'm going to make sure that they're matted to the petals. Then I'm going to animate the position property so they move up and outside of the center of the flower. I'll also animate the stroke color from red to yellow. Next, let's work on the pollen dots. Each of these circles is a shape layer within the shape layer. So I'm going to search for the scale property to bring up the scale property for each of these individual circles. To select all of these scale properties at once, if you marquee select over them, you can select them all at the same time and then click the stopwatch to set keyframes all at the same time. So I'm going to animate each circle from 0 to 100%, and then this last scale property is for the entire shape layer. So I'm going to animate this one from 200 to 100%, which will make it look like the circles are starting spread out and then moving closer together. Since the pollen dots are matted to the petals layer and the petals layer ends when the center layer starts, I'm going to hit Command-Shift-D to cut and duplicate the pollen layer at this point. And then on the duplicated version of the pollen layer, I'll set the track matte to the flower center. Here's where we're at so far. Since the stems for the flowers are all pretty similar, let's just have one stem for the entire project, and we'll delete any extra stems. I need to adjust the length of this stem for the daisy, so I'm going to animate the path property, and then I'll also animate the stroke color changing. I'm just going back into Illustrator to copy the correct hex code for the stroke color of the stem of the daisy. The last thing to do for this morph is the leaves. We need to get this shape into this shape. Because I've already made this animation, I know that when I tried to animate this path morphing into this leaf shape, I had a lot of trouble getting it to look nice while it was morphing. When you're animating the path property, you don't have control over the individual points on the path or their handles. And sometimes the handles will just break in the middle of the animation and then look fine at both of the keyframes. And there's not really a way to fix this when you're limited to just working with the path property. But there is a way to be able to have more control, and that's using a free script. There's a Create Nulls from Past script that comes with After Effects, but for this we're going to need the extended version, which is just a version that somebody made to make it better, and so you can download it here on this website. Once you have that installed, mine is right here. We need to select the path of this leaf. I'm going to start with the one on the bottom right, and then I'll just duplicate it and flip it to make the one on the left to save myself some work. So with this path selected, you want to make sure that handle controls are checked and also use locators is checked, and then click points follow nulls. That's going to create these controllers that we can use to animate the leaf. If we show all the shade layers, you can see that it's actually made all of these controllers, which we're going to need. So I'm going to select all of those, and then I'm also going to select this leaf bottom right and this leaf right, and I'm going to pre-compose these. So I'm going to hit Command-Shift-C, and then I'll name this leaf morph, and make sure you have the same options checked and hit OK. That's going to create this composition where I'm going to do all of this animation. Let's take this leaf, which is what we're morphing to, and bring it all the way to the top, turn on the visibility, and give it a red fill so that we can see what we're working towards. And let's also reduce the opacity and lock it. Now, instead of animating the path property for this layer, we're going to be animating these controllers. So the orange layers are representing the points, so we can keyframe the position of these points to animate this morph. And then the handles are the teal, and so if you adjust the handles, if you move the handles or keyframe the position, it's going to adjust the shape, just like a Bezier handle. If you move the teal handle controllers, the handles will be kind of like unlocked, or you can rotate the points and it will keep the handles locked. So I'm going to click here to select all of the orange labels and hit R to bring up the rotation property and set a keyframe at 1 second for all of the rotations. And then I'm going to make sure that no layers are selected and hit P on the keyboard to bring up the position property, and then select all of the layers except for this leaf bottom and click the stopwatch to set position keyframes. And I can move forward to 1 second 20 frames and start animating this. So I'm just going to move the orange point controllers and rotate them to move the handles like they're locked. And then I'll also move the handles to collapse handles or just adjust the shape of this path. If you want to completely collapse handles, the handles are parented to the points, so you can just zero out their position. Similar to what I did earlier, I'm going to make the new leaf start at 1 second 20 frames and everything for the old leaf end at 1 second 20 frames. Here's what we have so far. Let's add in that leaf line. So I'll cut this and paste it in this comp. And then let's animate the path property. Now back in the main comp, we have the right side working for the bottom leaf. But we need to move the layer order of this leaf morph, and I'm going to drop it all the way at the bottom, so it's behind the pot. Then I'm going to duplicate this, and then bring up the scale property, unlock the constrained proportions, and type in -100% to flip it for the other leaf. And that's going to morph now from here into this leaf. So we can delete this leaf left for the daisy. I'm going to repeat that process for the top leaf, morphing into the same leaf on the daisy. And again, I'm just making the one for the right side and then duplicating that comp and flipping it over by scaling it to -100% in the X direction. Here's what we have so far. From here, you can delete the leaf layers that we didn't need to use. Now that you've seen the core techniques that I use to create morphing animations, I'm going to walk through the rest of the morphs to describe what I did, but not go into as much detail because otherwise we'd be here for hours. I'm going to jump over into the finished version. One thing that's important to do that I haven't covered is to adjust the motion of your keyframes. So if I look at these keyframes in the graph editor, you can tell that they're not just easy ease and they're definitely not linear. So you want to go through and finesse the motion of your animations to make it look a little bit more interesting. If you compare the animation that I've done so far, which is linear keyframes, to the one where I've adjusted the keyframes in the graph editor to make the motion more interesting, you can tell that the second version is much more polished. I also added a principle of animation called follow through. So instead of everything just ending in its final position, it overshoots a little bit and bounces back, which just makes this look a little bit more fun. I'll link resources below that explain more about these concepts. Let's go through each of the morphs. So to get from the daisy to the yellow flower, starting with the pot, I just took this original shape that was originally the bowl-shaped planter, and I animated the path property and the color to morph the points and handles to make this shape. For the base, I used a separate rectangle, and this shape is matted to the shape of the pot, so I needed to increase the size so that you wouldn't see the edges of it as it's morphing into place. This shadow on the planter is the stripe that was originally on this bowl. I just animated the stroke width and the color, and also the position to move it into the right place. For the leaves, I worked backwards from this leaf to the daisy leaf, and I had to cut the layers. I morphed the center of the shape into the petal, and actually I started with the middle petal shape and then worked backwards to get to the center of the daisy. And the petals on the side just animate in, they're not morphing from anything, and same with this piece on the bottom. To get from the yellow flower to this blue flower, I animated the yellow petals shrinking down and morphing into a circle, which will be the center of this flower, and then the blue petals are just scaling out. The leaves between these two plants are pretty similar, so I just was able to morph them with the path property. For the planter, I also worked backwards, so I started with a new layer that's this shape of planter, and then I animated the path property working in the reverse order to make it into this hexagon shape. To get from this blue flower to this one in a vase, first I animated the path property of the pot into the vase and also animated the color and opacity. For the water, this is just a rectangle, and I added a zigzag to it, which you can find here. And then I also animated the horizontal position of it and the zigzags so that there's a subtle wave to it as it's rising. To animate the leaves, again, I used the path property and changed the color and rotation. I animated the blue petals scaling to make them disappear, and I animated the circle scaling up. For the lines in the center, I just rotated them to make this animation a little bit more interesting. Morphing from this blue flower into the rose uses techniques that you should already be familiar with by now, but one thing that was a little bit tricky was these lines. So I started with the blue flower lines and actually used the rose petal lines and worked backwards. So I had to create a few different versions of these because there's more blue lines than there are red lines. You can kind of see that they start to compile on top of each other. And then I also animated the path property of these petals so that I could curve them. So they start out straight, matching the blue lines, and then get curved and compiled into the lines on the rose. And finally, I made this animation loop by morphing the rose back into the tulip. If you want to learn more about everything that I did to make these morphs happen, you can download the project file and dissect it. So there you have it. That's the workflow for creating morphing animations. Using the techniques from this video, you can morph between all kinds of different graphics. Thanks so much for watching.